welcome friends and colleagues. It is my joy and privilege to be here with you. I'm Miriam Spies, a UCC minister and a PhD candidate at Emmanuel College. Thank you for coming to celebrate Reverend Dr. Sheryl Johnson's new book, Serving Money, Serving God, aligning radical justice, Christian practice, and church life. I'm grateful to call Sheryl and Kelly my best friends, and delighted to see Sheryl's recent work published and available to help shape our service to God in the church and the world. As we settle in, I invite you to name the land in which you are situated. I want to acknowledge that I live, write, worship, and pray on lands of Aniswaki, Haudenosaunee, and Wanderak, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. This land is covered by the Dashworth Wampum Belt Covenant, which was an agreement between the Haudenosaunee and us, the Arak, to share and care for the resources among the Great Lakes. This land is covered by the Between the Lakes purchase 1792 between the Crown and the Mississaugas, the Credit First Nation. Today, these lands are home to many indigenous peoples across Turtle Island. We recognize that we must do more to learn about the rich history of land so that we can better understand our roles as residents, neighbors, partners, and caretakers. Now it's my privilege to call on Reverend Dr. Kelly Colwell, aka Cheryl's House. Kelly is the Associate Minister for Digital, Hybrid, and Beloved Community at First Church in Berkeley, California. She also teaches at several of the graduate theological unions seminaries in the areas of worship, practical theology, and church leadership. Thank you for leading us in prayer, Kelly.
There we go. It's the spotlight, it's the highlight and the mute all at the same time. What a pleasure to see this group of people that is just an absolute smorgasbord of all of the places that Sheryl and I have been over the last many years. This is so cool. It's great to see you all. I want to invite you to take a couple of deep breaths. And I invite you to join me in prayer. Holy and living and present God, we ask from you today the courage to ask new questions about our money, our resources, our decisions that we make. We ask you to open our hearts and our minds to this new material and to grant us the stamina and the creativity to try new things, to take what we learn and what we build here and to try them out, to put them into practice in the service of your world, your people, all of your creation. All this we ask in the name of Jesus, who dances out ahead of us in any endeavor we try. Amen.
Thank you, Kelly. It's my honor to welcome Reverend Dr. Sheryl Johnson. As many of you here today are friends of Sheryl and others, bear with me as I share some of her amazing work you already know and learn from. Sheryl recently completed her PhD at Graduate Theological Union and is presently working remotely as the director of the Doctor of Ministry program and as professor of theology at St. Stephen's College, Edmonton. She also teaches as a visiting faculty lecturer at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary in Berkeley, California, and she served the Congregational Church of San Mateo, a United Church of Christ. Sheryl completed her MDiv and MPS at Emmanuel College. She was ordained in 2014 in the United Church of Canada. She serves Colwell, several United Church congregations in Toronto, the board of the Student Christian Movement in Canada, as well as the World Student Christian Federation. And there's so much more that could be said, but I've known her since 2008 as a person committed to faithfully living and serving in community, and a brilliant friend and mentor. Welcome, Sheryl.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you all so much for attending today. Yeah, as Kelly said, it's just such a gift to see you all here today. And Miriam, thank you so much for organizing and publicizing. Miriam, I've learned so much from you, and I am so grateful to have you as a colleague and as a friend. So, reason we're all here today, thank you so much for, celebrating the book. I think we'll maybe try to get a screenshot a little later. So if you have your copy, that's great. But if you don't have your copy yet, I know that some folks are still waiting on that. I thought I would perhaps start with a reading from the beginning, since I know not everyone has had a chance or an opportunity to read yet. So I'm delighted to share a little bit with you. So this is from the introduction. It's called, the title is Two Masters, God and Money. In progressive churches, we love to celebrate diversity. race, gender, sexual orientation, religion, age, disability, and so forth. We lift up all of these as aspects of the beauty of God's diverse creation, intended by God as part of the divine design. But sometimes we include class and economic differences in that list of characteristics. Of course, God cares for us all, but does God really create us rich and poor? Or are wealth and poverty the outcomes of oppressive systems that a liberating God commands us to work against? Systems such as racism, colonialism, patriarchy, and neoliberal capitalism. Does God really intend for some to have too little and some to have far more than too much? How does excessive wealth create poverty? When we look around our churches and communities, our nations, and the world, we can't help but realize how much of an economic divide exists. This situation is even more unsettling when we realize how these economic divisions fall along lines of other social factors such as race, a reality we name as sin. Now, not everyone will agree with me that wide wealth disparity is contrary to God's will. But if that's you, this isn't your book and probably not your book launch, so you can continue on your day. But if you believe in the prosperity gospel and which that God rewards good people with money, this book won't make a lot of sense to you. I am writing instead for those of us who believe that inequality is a spiritual problem. Maybe you aren't quite sure how to address it, but the idea that our relationship with God inevitably leads us to work for social justice resonates with you. If that makes sense to you, then you and I are co-conspirators in this work, and I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful that we get to try to figure out what to do about it together. We are not alone. And I'll skip ahead a little bit and share a little bit more. So at a 2008 denominational event for young adults, I'll add, this is where Miriam and I became friends at this particular event, a former moderator of the United Church of Canada, David Giuliano, shared that in his travels across Canada during his leadership term, he often met with young people not currently active in the church. Many would say to him something like, I love everything the United Church has done around radical inclusion and on the front lines of social justice struggles. I love its statements about important social issues. I'd love to be part of a church that embodies this. Can you recommend a congregation to me? As he told us this story, Giuliano admitted that he often wasn't sure how to respond or which church to recommend. He knew so many congregations were primarily concerned with their own survival, preoccupied with worries about their aging buildings and grief regarding past glories, which were now a distant memory. Even churches that did engage in work for justice often did so in a segmented way. Justice work was often seen merely as a side program of the church with an outward focus, rather than a core issue, core to their mission and identity, with these values deeply informing all aspects of the congregation's life. Still, Giuliano shared this story with the young adults gathered as a hopeful one. The theology of progressive churches resonates with many people, and the history of social and political engagement is inspiring, even to those who are not currently involved. Potential and possibility exist, but translating that progressive theology into practical congregational life has thus far eluded many of us. At the same time, this connection between beliefs and practices, faith and action is often celebrated as a hallmark of progressive Christianity. This engagement takes many forms, I'm sure, as many of you well know, because of your own ways that you support these forms of engagement, including community service, civic engagement, social justice, sermons on these themes, congregational activities that include even attending protests and marches for social and ecological justice, and at a denominational level, adapting prophetic statements that articulate theological support for seeking justice through public policy and action. While these commitments and activities are important to church identity, they are often approached as programs that engage broader society, but are not expected to shape internal church life and practice as well. These commitments generally focus outward toward others, locating the church in the role of a benevolent figure that should assist as it is able, but not primarily as an actor that is implicated in systems of oppression or facing significant issues of injustice internally. The church is largely presented and understood as a neutral space, and any engagement for justice is viewed as a net positive. The reality is so much more complex, but work to integrate justice into all aspects of church life matters. And scholars confirm that Giuliano's experience with young people seeking churches committed to justice is widespread. A 2016 Pew Research study found that 1 in 5 people who left their childhood religion did so due to a dislike of organized religion for reasons including pervasive hierarchy, and religious communities operating too much like businesses. This is similar to the findings of a 2009 Pew Research study that found about 50% of those who had become unaffiliated with religion had done so because they found religious people hypocritical, judgmental, or insincere. We can see in this research that an alignment between belief and action has serious practical implications, particularly considering the current rate of church decline and the rise of religious nuns. But the work of integrating justice into church finances isn't a growth strategy. It stands on its own merits and is the right thing to do, even if it turns some people away. All right, I'll pause there for now.
Wow, so powerful, Cheryl, and so much to dig into there, which we will have time to in a few minutes. But first, it is my delight to welcome Dr. Cynthia Moe-Lobeda. Cynthia Moe-Lobeda. Dr. Moe-Lobeda has written and co-written many articles and books and has lectured or consulted in many parts of the world in theology, ethics, and matters of climate justice, climate racism, moral agency, globalization, economic justice, public church, eco-feminist theology, and faith-based resistance to systematic oppression. Dr. Moe-Lobeda is the founding director of the Center for Climate Justice and Faith at Pacific Lutheran Theological Seminary. She served as professor of theological and social ethics there and at the graduate theological union in Berkeley, where she is a member of the ecological faculty. Moe-Lobeda is one of 3 North Americans appointed to a global team to advise the World Council of Churches and Lutheran World Federation on their work toward a new international financial architecture. Dr. Moe-Lobeda supervised Cheryl's doctoral work, which partly make up the book we're celebrating today. So thank you, Cynthia, for being with us and sharing with us today. Welcome.
Miriam, thank you so much for organizing this marvelous gathering. How just what a cool move that was. First, I want to say what a joy it has been to work with Reverend Dr. Sheryl Johnson since she began her doctoral work at the GTU. Yes, it has been my privilege and my joy to know Sheryl as a student, as a remarkably generous, big-hearted, insightful, and creative human being, and now as a skilled and trusted colleague. I feel as though I've seen this book, this wonderful book, through its conception and its long gestation and then its birth. And with much gladness, we, the people here gathered and others, welcome the birth of this book. So why is it so valuable, this volume, for the church and the world today? First, it is very rare to turn a dissertation into a truly readable book for the church. Sheryl, however, did it. And that means she has mastered both the art of writing sophisticated academic discourse, e.g. the dissertation, and the equally difficult art of penning accessible, engaging, regular human discourse. So hurrah. The voice in this book is faultlessly clear, engaging, and humble, yet authoritative. Secondly, Serving Money, Serving God identifies a truly significant and deep-seated fault line in church life. And this is the remarkable thing. It is a fault line that many faithful leaders of the church and of justice work in the church have not known existed, or at least have not consciously named and faced. That problem is the cavernous gap between what we profess to believe about the life of faith, and especially the practices of social justice in it, on the one hand, and what we practice in the financial matters of the church, on the other hand. A fault line or shortcoming that hinders faith communities' capacity to follow Jesus can be addressed only if it is acknowledged. If a shortcoming goes under the radar screen of consciousness, we simply carry on with it. So one gift of this book to the church is naming that problem. Sheryl notes that, and I quote, "The first step toward practicing our faith and engaging ethics is to name the gaps between what we believe and what we do," end quote. The church is blessed to have a magnificent calling. It is nothing less than embodying God's vision that all people, and indeed all of creation, might have life in its fullness. As you all are so aware, that includes building racial justice, economic justice, gender justice, and other forms of justice into daily life and the structures that shape it. That calling is betrayed if financial practices heed not the norms of justice, but the norms of predatory capitalism, what Sheryl, along with theorists around the world, call neoliberalism. So again, naming this gap is a significant gift to the church. Third, Sheryl does not stop at naming and describing the problem and then iterating the Christian call to do justice. Rather, she goes on to provide wise and realizable pathways for undoing that problem. That is, for envisioning and practicing justice-guided financial life. Next, this book is clear that integrating justice into church finance is highly contextual. There is no one-size-fits-all. Each congregation, denomination, or other group must respond to the needs and resources and other circumstances of its context. About this, serving God, serving money is indeed firm. However, to aid in that process, the book goes on to offer 3 guiding principles for the work of manifesting God's call to justice in financial life. Those 3 principles are reparations, jubilee together with Sabbath, and commoning. Well, a 5th great value of this book, it takes on truly difficult topics that often are avoided or swept under the carpet. What do I mean? Well, for example, Sheryl raises the problem of giving thanks to God for the resources we have without acknowledging that we might have them not as a gift from God, but as the result of cumulative histories of exploitation inherent in colonialism. Now, that is one complex challenge for anyone who values both giving thanks and honesty about the horrors of settler colonialism. In light of this, Sheryl suggests examining wealth to discern whether we meaning congregations, denominations, or individuals, examining our wealth to discern whether we may be called to transfer or redistribute it. And she invites reparations as a vehicle for that. Now, my point is not just that she dares to raise issues like this, but she also acknowledges the difficulties that they may pose. And then she gives clues for moving forward into that uncomfortable terrain in ways that may be life-giving and energizing. This is invaluable because matters like that are so difficult and so complex. In one of her most important lines, Sheryl advises, in light of that complexity, she advises, I quote, "Clearly, exploring colonial legacies is complicated work. But these complexities do not mean we should sidestep the issue," end quote. So, in short, serving God, serving money, does not fall into the trap of many progressive Christians. That trap is the tendency to declare God's vision without taking seriously how to embody it and how to overcome the challenges inherent in embodying it. This book is not only a call to imaginatively shift finance to serve God and others with justice-seeking love, it also is a valuable guide for doing just that. You all know as well as I do how good the church is at glorious proclamations without grappling with how we carry out those proclamations in the reality of life. Finally, I will say also that Sheryl's beauty as a person and her touching humor come through. I saw these and I smiled when I read, I quote, "Eternal life is not a promise God made to our buildings," end quote. So, who should read this book? Well, leaders of denominations and congregations, pastors, professors and students in seminary, people in the pew, people outside the church who may have been alienated by its failures to live up to its justice standards, and anyone who hungers to, in Ched Meyer's words, prioritize the gospel over the dominant economic story, end quote. So I thank you, Dr. Johnson, for giving the church and the world this remarkable book. Hurrah.
Thank you so much, Cynthia, and thank you for being with us today and sharing your wisdom too. Before we go on to our discussion, we wondered if we might get a screenshot So I invite those who have the book in their hands to raise it up. And I'm hoping, Kelly, can you get the shot and tell us when you're done? I see lovely books all around. Thank you. On Kindle and paperback. Awesome. Okay, now we have some time for questions and discussion, conversation. If you have a question for Cheryl, pop it in the chat, and I believe Kelly will read it out for us, or raise your hand on Zoom so we can call on you to unmute. Oh.
Well, just while you're gathering questions, thank you so much to Dr. Moe-Lobeda for that powerful response and for being the type of doctoral advisor that modeled ways to engage both church and academy and to be just as comfortable in all those various settings. So thank you so much for that really, really humbling response to my work. It truly means so much. Okay, yes, so some questions coming in. This is great.
Maybe we'll go to Andrew next. So Andrew, please unmute and ask away.
Thank you so much, Miriam, and thank you, Cheryl, for this amazing work. I am really looking forward to reading this. I apologize, I'm talking over my cat here, but and he likes the book too. I'm sure he'll like the book too. I am wondering about a dynamic that I see a lot, especially for people of our generation here in the Bay Area specifically, who go into ministry work or church work or religion already on fire with these kind of justice ideals, the kind of ethics, and also the experience for a lot of us of being on that sort of lower end of the economic spectrum, and so we're sort of the victims of the current system, going into a lot of churches in the Bay Area. Not all of them, of course, but a lot of churches in the Bay Area that are filled with extremely wealthy people, because it's the Bay Area. It's Silicon Valley, it's San Francisco, and so I'm here in Marin County, and the churches here are fantastically wealthy, or at least the individuals in the churches are fantastically wealthy, and so someone like me coming in, fairly radical economic views, an experience of sort of genteel poverty, so to speak, coming in, how do I speak to this sort of entrenched kind of capitalist system, which, filled with, as I think you identify in the book, it's from what you've read so far, it sounds like people who at least believe, yes, we should be just, but they're so entrenched in those kind of systems. At the church where I am, the people who are on the finance committee of the church are accountants and Fortune 500, CEOs and people like this who are entrenched in the system because they know about money. So they're running the church's money, program. So how do we speak to that dynamic?
Thank you, Andrew. Thanks for that excellent question. And I think it's such a conundrum, and I'm really grateful that I've had the opportunity to do some interviews with pastors and church leaders. And I think it's a very common dynamic. And even, research findings find that as well, that often, pastors are more progressive than their congregations. And I think it leads to a lot of complexities, especially when those same pastors are relying on the church for their salaries. So I definitely hear the challenge of the situation. And I guess I would say the best that that I've seen is to try to create on-ramps for people into this work. And so to not come in as sort of a lone voice, maybe there's, prophetic place for that as well. But I think maybe more strategic sometimes is to find places, people in the church who maybe are already, have a bit of a critical view of the economy to, challenge the idea that the people with the most business experience are the ones necessarily who should only be equipped to serve in financial leadership as well. So to invite new people into some of those roles, perhaps to, I think relationship can be an educator in terms of getting people who maybe haven't had the experience of interacting with those who are more racially or economically marginalized, starting, I think, relationship and charity isn't everything, but I think it can be a starting place, at least for building relationships, for exposing people to realities that are very different than their own. I think, the Bible itself provides so much by way of a starting place for doing some of this work. And so I think if we can, sometimes, the Bible is just distant enough. It's kind of a third space that can allow us to engage in questions of justice and injustice in a way that's not so direct to today's world that people maybe get defensive, but can invite them to imagine and think about different possibilities for how to be in the world. So I think that, I certainly hear the challenge of doing this work, but I think there are a lot of, possibilities for introducing these ideas. And perhaps, I think maybe what seems to be what a lot of folks say, the more effective strategy, rather than, saying you're terrible and everything you do is wrong, but rather to invite people to, to question their worldviews by different experiences, getting different relationships, and not just, not trusting that they're going to make those connections themselves, but to, help to guide them along the way to draw forth the connection between maybe individual experiences of marginalization, and then to introduce them to those systemic factors. So a little bit of how I'd answer that. Thank you for the question.
Sheryl, I'm going to jump in with a couple questions from the chat that I think are sort of related to each other. Sort of about your writing process, about the process of bringing this project to fruition. One question is, what was the hardest chapter to write? And the other is, what are you most proud of when you reflect on the process of bringing this project into being?
Yeah, thanks for those questions. I guess I would say in some ways, the hardest, maybe not specific chapter, but hardest aspect. I think sometimes there were certain points in the process and certain points even in my PhD journey where I both felt sometimes like I wished I had chosen a project that was less sort of directly personal to me. Of course, I think in the end, I'm really glad that I did it. But on the other hand, I think there's definitely an element of, including a lot of my own experiences in the book, and, thinking about, it's just very directly connected to my own experience and story. And sometimes I wish if I'd studied something about, 15th century, so it kind of disconnected a little bit more from my own life and sort of situations that other people, were in the room at the same time. Some of the decisions that were made, were written about. And I just don't really, I think I was worried sometimes that people might feel like I was sort of critiquing from on high, or that I didn't get the depth of the financial challenges of certain situations that I was writing about. So I would say that was, maybe it's one of the more challenging aspects of the book. And just the more you care about something, the more, you sort of care how it's received and how it lands for folks. And also you just really, at least for me, feel a real sense of wanting this to have an impact, of wanting to see it lead and contribute towards change that I already see as happening. But I think that when you have high hopes for what it could do, I think that, it's also challenging in a way. In terms of feeling proud, it does feel, it's so gratifying to find other people already in this past week who have been reaching out to me, people who I haven't met, folks who are saying, I've always sensed a little bit of a disconnect, that we, preach really radical messages about justice, but yet we, seem to be still operating out of the assumptions that whatever means will raise the most money is best, or that institutional survival is necessarily our goal. So it's been really wonderful to hear folks even folks that I don't know, who are writing to say that this sort of brought words and expression to some of the challenges that they've experienced in their own lives. So that's been, really amazing to hear. And I'm excited about the partnerships and collaborations that might come from this project.
Thank you, Cheryl. I love how you invite us to be co-conspirators. That's wonderful. I will invite Joseph to unmute.
Thank you. Thank you for having this space. Cheryl, congratulations. Yay. Good to see you. So coming from the perspective of just daily church life and me being a congregation member and just speaking, I guess, for the a congregation as a whole, who do we go to when we want to make these kinds of changes that you're proposing? And so the context of my question, again, as just a regular everyday churchgoer, is you mentioned institutional survival a couple of seconds ago. And so I come from two unique institutions that were very limited in how they could help our church change our relationship with money. I was a Presbyterian, and so the Presbyterian Church itself as an institution is going through its own share of troubles. So I went to a small church in San Francisco that almost died until it partnered with another church. And then that relationship soured because the partnership was contingent on us bringing money. Apparently, this was their expectation, is that we would bring in the congregants and, it would help with their financial issues. I'm also Roman Catholic. And that is not necessarily an institution that everyday people going to church like me can turn to. So, there's a power dynamic in addition to, having a relationship with money that we have to grapple with. And so if we as just everyday community members want to do this, where do we go to? Because our natural response is to turn to the pastor, turn to the priest, turn to the elders, right? But sometimes we're not in alignment. Anyway, congratulations again.
Thanks, Joseph. Thanks for the question, and thanks for being here today. Yeah, I think you're so right to say that it's not always easy to know where to begin. And so I would say, part of my answer would be to know your tradition. So know, what sources you can appeal to. So I know in some traditions, the Bible plays a really prominent role. So perhaps there's, biblical stories you can lift up, maybe the Catholic tradition, Catholic social teaching, or some of the, wonderful statements that exist, whatever is authoritative in your community. Sometimes that can be a helpful entry point into these conversations. I think also, getting involved in where there are opportunities for committee work or leadership in different ways. I sometimes reflect on, how sometimes the more justice involved people, get involved with that outreach committee or the social justice team, and that makes total sense. But at the same time, how cool and what possibilities might exist if those folks who are passionate about justice also join the property committee or the finance team or things like that, and maybe have those folks, serve in other ways, and that might shift things. So yeah, I would say, similar to my answer about pastors, it's good to, know your context, know your allies, not to try to do this work alone if you can, but if there are, pastors who are have a similar perspective or other congregation members, to work together and to, think strategically about how to bring forth this work. And I would say also to do it not so much as, sometimes you have to say this is wrong. And there's certainly times for that, but on the other hand, to also show a positive vision of what could be and why that could be exciting and might bring in new life and vibrancy into the community in a new way, not to save the church, but to do what's right. And to, if a lot of our churches are likely to close or die, I say maybe that frees us, right? Why don't go as boldly and faithfully as we can if we're likely to close anyway? So thanks for the question.
I want to jump in with another couple questions from the chat. So one is Laurel is asking for examples of creative financial practices or financial justice practices that you've seen or heard about churches doing. if you just want to highlight one or two. And then also a little bit about how you see this book getting into church use, with the question of, is this the kind of book that you see like a general study group in the church taking up, or do you have in mind that it's more for the finance and administration team, or that it's more for like a few leaders to take up and then kind of spread it out that way? It's basically, how many copies do you think a church should get?
Lovely questions. Yeah, thanks for asking. So yeah, in terms of examples, I do share a few in the book. One of them that I found quite interesting is a sort of multi-site church in Philadelphia area, where folks, they really, have done a lot to really think, about how to allow people to, who are impacted by debt, to get free of debt, to think about how people can live more simply. So they do a lot of, sharing of secondhand goods with one another, so that people can, step out of mainstream economic structures a bit more. They also, probably their most famous program is these groups called debt annihilation circles, where people with credit card debt, church members with credit card debt, formed these small groups, and they looked at the interest rates of one another's credit card debts and pooled their resources together. So to start paying off whoever's debt has the highest interest rate first. So eventually the community would work together to pay off that debt using some seed funding from the wider congregation. So it's not just the people with debt on their own, but they're getting funds supporting them from the wider church as well, and to also hopefully be able to pay off the debt faster, to pay less interest if at all possible, by paying that higher interest debt together first, and doing some other things alongside the process in terms of mutuality and solidarity, and trying to also look at some of the root causes of why the situation of debt was encountered in the first place. So yeah, that's one example I would share that I think really gets at more on a congregational level, how to support one another, both support in terms of emotional and spiritual support, but also really practical support. And yeah, and I think we often we can't help in situations where we don't know. So often in sort of church prayers, we might pray a lot for certain people's, health struggles, at least certain health conditions. Maybe mental health conditions are a little less spoken publicly about. But, if we don't know that someone is struggling financially, if we don't sort of preach about examples of people going through economic hardship, if we don't kind of model talking about finance with one another, then it's also very hard to support. A lot of times people, say, oh, I would love to support, but I just don't know who in my congregation might be going through a difficult time, or, how can we leverage connections that may exist in a church if we have some people who maybe, have opportunities for employment, and other people who might be in need of employment. So sometimes just opening up the conversation can also provide some avenues for connections, and for helping, just even creating a bit of a social safety net, where folks know that if they're going through a difficult circumstance, they can turn to their fellow congregation members for assistance.
Thank you, Cheryl, for your responses. And let's invite Hannah to unmute and ask.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. I have a question about, that most churches, I guess all churches are built on the land and using the land, and there's the time that can happen selling the real estates. Church has the real estates, and selling the property, and then it's kind of, we have this understanding now that we return some portion of or some percentage of the profit or the proceed to back to the indigenous community, like 10% or even 20% or 12%, but giving back to just portion of the selling the land doesn't justify the fact that we are still dealing the land that is actually the traditionally and is still the indigenous. And so how should we understand church actually dealing with the land, and when we want to just go beyond giving back to a certain percentage, but do better, moving away from the shame or guilt, but how can I love when you said internal justice, internal governance of our practice. So what could be the internal justice or internal governance to help better or do better with the, when there's the church facing the moment that they sell something and then property and the land, and what we do with that, going beyond giving back just in percentage.
Yeah.
Do you have you written?
Yes, I understand. Yeah, I think I understand your question, and I think it's a really great one. And I think, yeah, first of all, the acknowledgement and the awareness of, our histories, I think is so important. So looking at, the indigenous land, how colonialism operated where we are, the role of the church in that, looking also at, racial dynamics in terms of in different immigrant groups that may have lived on the land. So I think knowing that rich history is such an important step, and knowing the role of the church in either, furthering colonization, perhaps being part of white flight, perhaps, or neighborhood gentrification. In some cases, the presence or absence of churches can be really, really complicated in terms of all of those historical and present day dynamics. So yeah, I think you're so right to say we don't only have to think about that in times when churches are being sold, but I think to have relationships now, to look to Indigenous partners and other community partners, and to ask that question of, we acknowledge that this land is not, ours, that we challenge this idea of sort of private property, and to ask, what would it mean to be good stewards and to be in right relationship through our property right now. And, it could be that some percentage, some churches have more property than they need. So they might have some portion of the land that perhaps could be given back or used for a different purpose, or it could be that the local Indigenous leaders or other communities say, we actually would really love just some building space to be able to do certain types of programs or projects. So maybe providing space in kind. Or maybe, there's a lot of creative possibilities. And I think that, and I think there's also some churches that are saying, maybe we don't want to be owners of the land, but we still want to meet for worship. So maybe, if our building becomes owned by a community cooperative or another group, maybe we could just become renters of this space. And that could be another way of, of continuing to meet, but also, changing the property owner versus renter relationship around, such that the property owners are perhaps the original peoples of the land, or just a more diverse group of community members and stakeholders in that work. So yeah, there's a lot of creative work going on around that, and I really appreciate your question.
We're not going to be able to get to every single question in the chat, but I want to highlight one more, which is a request from Rachel about Bible stories. Now, I know you've got a bunch of stuff in I know what's in this book. I know you've got a bunch of stuff in this book that are examples and ways to read scripture that might be helpful for communities. Rachel was lifting up that a lot of times when she's bringing up these kind of stories like labor in the vineyard or others, that students and congregation members are quick to spiritualize and look for kind of metaphor and like, what does it mean? And not really take the practical material question into account. So I'm wondering if you could highlight one or two instances in scripture that you think might be helpful resources as communities try to think really practically about putting those, deep faith commitments and value commitments into action.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Thanks for the question. I think you're so right. I think so often, we do kind of spiritualize certain stories, but I think that, showing the ways that certain biblical stories have been used to inspire alternative ways of living, I think that can be really helpful. So thinking about, for instance, for the story of Acts, where all the believers held everything in common, whether or not that actually happened aside. But I think to look at, throughout history, different communities, different, Christian communities have tried to live into that with maybe greater or lesser success, but to really just show the diversity of ways that people have tried to live into some of these practices through their material lives together. I think that that can help for people to start to see some diverse ways that people have tried to enact these stories. So to, not just tell the story from ancient times, because I think sometimes that can be a little bit disconnected or feel distant to people. Whereas, to say, well, this community read this story and this is how they tried to live into this, and this community read this story. And, I think, same around Jubilee, that there were all these campaigns around, the year 2000, especially, and Jubilee debt relief, and really trying to, and still today, the idea of debt and debt relief and climate debt and all of these things that some communities at least do so from a scriptural foundation. So to sort of, model for church people to say, these are different ways that that folks have tried to live into this passage, and perhaps, from different parts of the world, or perhaps even more locally, if that will resonate better in the community as well, to say, this is how that could be lived into. What do you see as possibilities for our context today, so that people are getting a little bit more familiar with the idea of translating biblical stories into practice.
Thank you so much, Cheryl.
Miriam.
Kelly has this up in a couple links for the book in case you haven't yet. I got your copy. And once again, a huge thank you to all of you two for coming. If you read the book, Cheryl would love it for you to leave a review on Amazon or Goodreads or other websites, and recommend this powerful, important book to colleagues, churches, seminaries, people in society, basically everyone you meet. Thank you to Cheryl for writing this wonderful work that is so needed in our churches and today. Thank you to Cynthia, not only for your leadership today, but also your guidance and support of Cheryl's work. We will end in a minute, but if you have questions that are burning, take around for a few minutes. Thank you for Kelly. Thank you, Kelly, for gathering us in prayer, for announcing tag questions, and for doing the tech, and for sending us out with God's blessing.
Thanks, Miriam. I want to just take a moment to really acknowledge how much work Miriam put into publicizing this and making sure that everybody could find their way here. Thank you so much for the support of getting this book out into the world. And now I invite you to join me in one more moment of prayer. And in this, if you have a book with you, I invite you to grab onto it and join me in praying that the Holy Spirit would get this work into the hands of everybody who needs it. That the material in this book would truly make its way into the churches that have resources to share. That all of us would find the courage and the hope and the patience and the connection to each other, and truly the faith to step into new practices, to take our cherished values and make them real in the most practical ways that we make decisions in our churches. All this in the name of the Holy Spirit who animates all of our work together. Amen.